In this workbook, it's called Partial 2. It's actually a representation of what we did in the previous movie. In that previous movie, we went through the recording process. We copied the data. We used paste special and transpose to transpose the data into row 1 across the screen this way. And we kept the macro recorder on as we did this for the next 3 sets of names as well. And the whole idea of doing this was to recognize that if we do it in the correct way, if we use absolute and relative references in the correct way, the code that we will have created is going to be repetitious. So let's take a look at that code. Alt F11. It's the only macro in this workbook. There are a couple of changes I might want to make to it, but as we look at the code, and this was done in the previous macro, I did introduce empty lines to bring out the idea that starting here, these actions that we see right here are exactly the same as what we see right here and down here. And although I didn't complete the full cycle here, even down here we begin to see the same thing is happening. When we do recognize this, we can clean up the data, and then we can introduce some of the structures in VBA that are going to allow us to move through the data completely. Now, I'm going to remove the repetitious data. Remember, this is the portion that gets repeated. We see that over and over and over again. So I'm going to highlight all this portion of the code right here and simply press delete. Now, when I typed in the macro name, I made a mistake here, and just a minor one, of course, and the name can be anything I want. I meant to type data, and I typed date, so we can change that. And you can change the macro name anytime you wish, of course. I usually in a macro get rid of these lines. It's simply a repeat. Of course, that has the misspelling in there. Get rid of that anyway. If you assign the keystroke shortcut, it appears here as a comment. And as mentioned in earlier movies, don't change this and think that you've really changed the keystroke shortcut because you have not. That's done elsewhere. I'm going to click up here and also press backspace. And I could get rid of the empty rows, but I'll keep them there just for clarity here. So we're now ready to do something a little different, and I meant to get rid of this code, and I will now get rid of this code as well. This is what we want to do over and over and over. The question often comes up as we look at VBA. Do we need to understand everything here? When we had on the recording process, we were able to watch the code being created. Let me again go to split screen. If we don't see the restore button up there, if it's a box, we can move to the bottom or top of the screen. Make this a bit smaller this way. If you'd like to change the size of the font as you see it within the macro code, go to the Tools menu in the VBA window, choose Options, and then Editor Format, consider a different font size. I do want to keep that text large and clear so we can see it. I'll keep it at size 16. When you're working with it, perhaps you might want a smaller size there. So no real change is needed. So there's the code that's been recorded, except for the very beginning and very end, which for the moment are not important. Let's remind ourselves what this macro has done. And now switching into the Excel window, click here, we'll restore that, reshape it a bit. Let's remind ourselves what's happened here. The macro begins by going to cell B1 and then highlighting 6 cells downward like this. Now to see this a little bit better, I'll collapse the ribbon here. You can do this with Control F1. This is within the Excel worksheet. Control F1 is one way, or simply double click the current tab. Control F1, there we go. So what does this macro do? Looking at the code up above, we jump to cell B1, we highlight 6 cells, we copy the data, and then what do? Active cell.offset 0, 2. What does that mean? From the location of the active cell, currently B1, we're going to move 2 columns to the right. We're not changing rows. That's why we see the 0. 2 columns to the right, we get there, and then what? We select a single cell. A1 in no way, in this example here, means literally go to cell A1. It means select a single cell. And once we get there, what do? We use paste special. And by the way, a lot of this code here is automatic or default, what we sometimes call a default. We don't actually need it there, but it certainly doesn't hurt. The key portion of this is transpose, which means turn that column layout into row layout. In other words, flip the data sideways. There are different ways of describing it. We see what's happening there. Now, if we want our code to look a little bit more compact, and this is certainly not a requirement, we could, for example, remove this portion right here. Now, I know that isn't really necessary, but I'm going to highlight it and delete it just to show that it looks a little tidier. Now, what do we do after this? The active cell is currently right here. We've just done the paste special. Now, what do? we move down 6 rows. That means down to row 7 and over 2 columns leftward. And we highlight the next 6 cells like this. So that line is being represented by what's happening right here up above in the code, this line right here. The next line is something you certainly wouldn't recognize at first. And this really doesn't kick in until we try to copy. And so what we want to be able to do next is come back up here and copy. This simply removes the so-called marquee lights that you see. For example, when I highlight this text here and I press Control-C to copy, those are sometimes called marquee lights or marching ants, and application.cut copy mode isn't really needed. Now, you wouldn't know that at first, and it certainly is not wrong to keep it here, but a bit later we might get rid of that line. But this is what we want to do over and over and over again. And one approach could be, and this is based on what you might have seen in a previous movie, we could use a construction called for, sometimes called a for loop. For, how many times do we want to do this? Well, and eventually we might want to do it 400 times. You'll see in the next movie that it's best to test out a macro. Maybe we only want to do this 5 times. So we can set up a temporary name, a name like counter, for example. It can be any name you wish. It's a variable, equal 1 to 7. And after the code right here, we put in next and use that same word that we used up above, counter. So we could use this approach. The disadvantage of this is this will perform the operation an explicit number of times. Let's say that the lists that we will be working with eventually will have a different number of records in them. So if we're working with the list right now, we could put in 400 and it will work 400 times, but we want some flexibility. So although this feature does have some viability in some cases, the for construction here, it's not the best approach here. And again, based on some things that we talked about in a previous movie, this is going to work better if we use a do loop. It ends with the word loop. As I click up above here, we're going to change this. There's some variations on this, and I won't go through all the variations, but the most efficient way to do this is the loop called until, do until. In other words, we want to be doing all of these actions here. And by the way, when you sometimes highlight other data as I'm doing here, you might get an error like this. Simply ignore it. We want to perform these actions. In other words, we want to do them until the active cell is empty. And this approach was discussed in a previous movie. Is empty, active cell. Those are both keywords as you type them. There's nothing unusual about them. But as we press enter or click on a different line, they will readjust their appearance. Some of the letters will become capitalized. Some of the text will turn blue. And there we are. So this is the approach we will ultimately be using. This will allow us to go through the data completely. But the key step here in the previous movie was to identify the code that has repeated. And then in this movie, you saw how we get rid of the repetitious code, keep only the code we need, and then use the VBA code that will allow us to move through all of the data.